Admiral Ronan Blackwell eased open the door to the JSOC conference room, expecting the same quiet pre-dawn stillness he encountered every morning, but instead he froze in place. At the long, polished table sat a single woman, Lieutenant Mara Cade, early 30s, wearing a plain intel uniform with no patches, no visible rank, and absolutely no logical reason to be in a room reserved for senior leadership. Yet there she was, calmly breaking down a battle-scarred M107 Barrett, as if the rifle were simply an extension of her own hands. Footsteps slowed in the hallway as officers passing by caught sight of her, low whispers drifting in, someone muffling a laugh, another muttering, "Why's an intel clerk touching that beast?" Blackwell's voice cut straight through the room. "Lieutenant, explain why you're here." Mara didn't react, didn't look up, simply continued working with a steady, quiet precision that didn't match her rank, her uniform, or anything her personnel file claimed about her. As Blackwell stepped closer, he noticed something in her handling of the rifle, something no ordinary intel officer should possess. Before we get into it, remember to subscribe to Major Tom's Tales so you never miss these stories of service and sacrifice, and drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from today. Lieutenant Mara Cade looked like the kind of person people dismissed without even thinking about it. Standard Navy intel attire, no combat insignia, no rank showing beneath the collar, no medals, no swagger. Nothing that suggested she had ever stepped farther than a desk at Redwater Base. She seemed forgettable to most. The type of junior officer who blended so well into the background she barely left a shadow. But the longer Admiral Ronan Blackwell watched her, the more he noticed the things she couldn't hide. The focused intensity in her movements, the surgical calm in her hands, and the stillness of someone who had lived closer to danger than her quiet uniform would ever admit. Blackwell had spent over 40 years in special operations, leading SEAL teams across Iraq, Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and more unnamed regions than he cared to count. He had buried teammates, carried strangers out of fire, and learned to read people in seconds, a skill carved into him by time and loss. And the woman in front of him, sitting alone before sunrise while field stripping a Barrett 50 like she was brushing dust off an old friend, was nothing like what her file suggested. He lifted her paperwork from the folder, clean, tidy, almost suspiciously ordinary. Naval Intelligence Analysis Division, assigned to JSOC 8 months earlier. No deployments, no long-range quals, no weapons specialties. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Explained how she handled a rifle heavier than some Marines with a level of grace most snipers never achieved in a lifetime. Mara didn't speak. She didn't defend herself or explain why a battle-worn M107 sat in front of her. She simply worked, slow, smooth, efficient, exhaling softly with each piece she set aside. She ignored the officers whispering in the doorway and didn't react to the snide comments slipping in from the hall. Even as people smirked, tossing around intel clerk plays sniper jokes, she stayed composed, almost detached, as if their opinions were nothing more than wind brushing against a closed window. That stillness unsettled people. It intrigued Blackwell. He stepped closer, studying her hands. The smudged fingerprints on the receiver, the faint pitting along a barrel weathered by sandstorms no stateside weapon ever endured, the subtle line of custom machining along the crown. Work he hadn't seen in decades. Work only old-school scout snipers and master craftsmen ever knew how to do, techniques nearly extinct. Something didn't add up. Something was being hidden. Mara finally paused to reach for a cloth, and that's when Blackwell noticed another detail, a field notebook beside her gear. The notebook beside her gear had frayed edges, a stained cover, and pages swollen with the kind of moisture that only years of desert humidity could bake into paper, and no intel officer carried something like that unless they had spent time in places no public map admitted existed. Blackwell glanced toward the doorway just as a familiar figure stepped in. Master Chief Owen Calder, mid-50s, a Somalia scar running along his jaw and eyes sharp enough to cut through fog. The man had trained half the long-range shooters in special operations throughout the 90s and early 2000s, and the second he spotted Mara's rifle he froze, not even looking at her as he spoke directly to the weapon. "What in God's name? Who taught you to tune a barrel like that?" Mara stayed silent. She didn't need to answer because her hands already had. Captain Leora Stroud entered right after him, the commanding officer of Special Warfare Development Group, posture crisp and analytical even before sunrise. Her gaze swept across the room. Blackwell, Calder, Mara, the rifle. And something in her expression shifted. Whether recognition or suspicion was unclear, but she chose to hold back, waiting for Blackwell to speak. He turned her file toward her and tapped the page. "Your record says Intel. Your hands say something else entirely. So, I'll ask again, Lieutenant. What are you really doing here?" Mara finally met his eyes, not with fear or defiance, but with a quiet acceptance, as if she'd known this moment would eventually find her. She didn't offer excuses or additional details. She simply replied, "Cleaning my rifle, sir." A response so impossible it became the least believable thing she'd said. Admiral Blackwell didn't allow the silence to linger. He wanted answers, and he wanted them immediately. But each time he pressed her, Mara supplied only short, crisp, perfectly factual replies that revealed absolutely nothing. "Who authorized that weapon?" "It was transported with my issued gear, sir." "Why do you have an M107 at all?" "It was assigned to me." "Assigned by whom?" "Operational channels, sir." Not a tremor in her voice, not a single tell. Nothing for him to grab onto, and the lack of answers only tightened the unease in his gut. Word spread fast. By the time Mara stepped into the hallway with Blackwell behind her, a half-circle of officers had already formed, their curiosity mixing with smug amusement. Lieutenant Grant Mercer stood at the center, arms folded like he was watching a comedy he already knew the punchline to. Mercer, a decorated SEAL sniper with 9 loud years of service and a confidence bordering on arrogance, took one look at Mara's rifle case and let out a bark of laughter. "Intel kids don't rebuild 50 cals," he bragged for everyone to hear. "That thing will drop her on her ass." Laughter broke out. Phones appeared. Someone muttered, "This is going in the group chat tonight." Some recorded openly, others pretended not to, but everyone knew the clips would be circulating before breakfast. Mara didn't react. She didn't even lift her head. She absorbed the noise the way someone tolerates bad weather. Annoying, loud, but meaningless. Her silence didn't resemble fear or embarrassment. It felt like endurance, like she'd heard far worse in much harsher places. Blackwell noticed. Calder noticed. Even Stroud paused, observing Mara like a chess player examining an unexpected move. At last, the Admiral stepped between her and the gathering crowd. "Lieutenant Mercer," he said sharply, "if you're done posing, we're heading to the range." Mercer smirked. "What for, sir? To see if she can hold the thing without tipping over?" A couple officers snorted. Blackwell ignored them. "Cade, with me." That was all. The crowd followed. Some came purely for entertainment, convinced the situation would end in humiliation. Others followed for the mockery, and a few walked behind her because something in her composure unnerved them. People who fear nothing usually have a reason. The long-range test range stretched out ahead, steel plates set at carefully measured intervals. The sun hadn't yet crested the horizon, leaving the valley washed in pale gray. A stubborn crosswind slid across the ground, the kind that made most shooters reconsider ambitious shots. Mara didn't glance at the growing crowd behind her. She didn't look at Mercer, who stood with his arms crossed and his ego inflated like a parade balloon, waiting for her to fail. "Range conditions are unpredictable," he said loudly. 800 might be too much for her first go. The chuckles behind him confirmed they agreed. Blackwell folded his arms. "Cade, whenever you're ready." Mara knelt, unwrapped her M107 with the same reverence someone might show a folded flag, and set up her position with clean, efficient certainty. No fidgeting, no wasted motion, not a hint of hesitation. Mercer stepped forward with a voice so soaked in sarcasm it practically dripped off him, insisting she'd missed the very first plate at 800 meters. Mara didn't react, didn't even acknowledge him. She simply slid a single round into the chamber, locked the bolt, settled her cheek against the stock and let her breathing slow until it softened into a steady rhythm. Her finger rested along the frame with an almost delicate stillness, and then she fired. The heavy, rolling crack tore across the range, lifting the early dusk as the steel at 800 meters rang out like a church bell. Someone behind Mercer let out a low whistle, but Mara didn't respond. She just reached calmly for the next round. Blackwell watched her with eyes narrowing by the second. This wasn't luck. This wasn't inexperienced guessing. Everything she did was too controlled, too refined, too practiced. She squeezed off another round with 300 meters, and the plate sang again. Mercer's posture shifted, his confident smirk beginning to slip. "2 lucky hits," he muttered, but he didn't sound convinced. Mara sent a third round downrange, 800 meters, and the steel answered again, clean and unmistakable. This time, the laughter vanished entirely, replaced by hushed whispers. "No intel officer shoots like that. Who trained her? Is she even intel?" Mara didn't look their way, didn't smile or show even a flash of pride. She just kept moving with the same quiet discipline as if no one else even existed. Mercer tried clawing back his dignity, saying the shots didn't prove anything, that anyone could rehearse the distances, that maybe it was politics or gender, until Calder whipped around so sharply that Mercer bit off the rest of the sentence. "You think gender helped her hit those plates? Or does it just burn you that someone half your size handles recoil better than you ever have?" Mercer went crimson. Captain Stroud said nothing, but her expression had shifted from amusement to something far more focused. Blackwell couldn't take his eyes off Mara. The more she fired, the more uneasy he became. Not because she was good, but because she was too good. Her micro-adjustments were razor-precise, tiny corrections only someone forged by real combat, not simulations, would make. She wasn't shooting like an intel officer. She was shooting like someone who had lived with a rifle for months on end. As the smoke drifted away, a heavy silence settled over the range. Mara stayed utterly steady, breathing so quietly it seemed none of this mattered to her. But to everyone else, it changed everything. The question looming in the air was no longer whispered but silently screamed. Who was she really? Mara packed her rifle with the same calm precision she had shown while firing. No grandstanding, no satisfaction, no acknowledgement of the stunned crowd around her. She moved with the same steady confidence of someone who carried far more history than her personnel file would ever reveal. Calder stepped closer, watching the subtle way her fingers curled around the rifle's grip as she lifted it. He recognized the reverse pressure recoil control instantly, a detail so subtle most shooters didn't even know it existed, but he did. It was a technique reserved for Marine Scout snipers and deep long-range operators. the kind of shooters who practically lived in the dirt, fighting recoil rather than letting it rule them until instinct replaced conscious thought. Intel officers didn't hold rifles like that. Mara shifted the weapon slightly, revealing faint machining lines along the barrel's crown. Calder's breath hitched. He knew that pattern, old, nearly extinct, the kind of accurizing work he had seen only once in his entire life. And the man who had done it was a legend, a sniper so gifted younger operators passed his name around like folklore. Calder said nothing, not yet, but everything in his posture changed. The mockery was gone. He was analyzing her now, not dismissing her. Captain Stroud joined them, arms folded, eyes sharpened with a level of attention absent earlier. She wasn't staring at the rifle. She was staring at the name printed on the corner of the weathered notebook beside Mara's kit, Cade. Stroud knew that name. She'd read it in an after-action report from Fallujah years ago, attached to a Marine reconnaissance sniper who had dragged wounded men out of a kill zone no one returned from. A man whose death had hit special operations deeper than they ever admitted. She held the realization quietly. Not yet. Blackwell stepped closer as Mara slung the rifle over her shoulder. When she adjusted the strap, her collar shifted slightly, revealing a thin, pale scar slicing diagonally across her upper chest. It wasn't new. It wasn't accidental. It was the kind of scar earned crawling across brutal shale ridges under fire, the kind of ridges where rock shredded everything it touched. No intel assignment in the world left someone with that mark. Only people who had crawled on their stomach under real fire carried scars like that, and no intel assignment on Earth created marks of that kind. Blackwell's suspicion deepened. He had spent far too many years around operators who sharpened their skills through pain and survival to mistake the signs. Mara moved like one of them. She breathed like one of them. She reacted like someone forged by danger, and she wore that scar as if she'd earned it long before Redwater Base ever entered her record. When she reached for her notebook, Blackwell noticed something he had missed earlier. Fine grains of tan sand pressed permanently into the page edges, fused into the paper the way only years in harsh deserts could do. He rubbed some between his fingers. Not local training sand, not even stateside terrain. This was the light, fine Syrian sand that clung to everything after nights spent lying across ridgelines waiting for an HVT to appear. That was the moment his suspicion hardened into certainty. Calder stepped beside him and lowered his voice. "Sir, that crown work, those wind calls, that's old-school craft," he murmured. "Stuff we stopped teaching decades ago." Blackwell didn't answer. Calder let the weight of his words settle. Whoever trained her was one of us. The truth landed with the heaviness of dust settling after detonation. Mara didn't react to any of it. She stood quietly, rifle at her side, face unreadable, but the room around her had already shifted. The same officers who had laughed earlier now whispered in uneasy tones. Mercer stared at her with a mix of frustration and something colder, fear. Maybe envy, or the sinking realization that he had challenged someone he absolutely shouldn't have. Stroud's attention fixed on the name printed on the corner of Mara's worn notebook, Cade. She remembered seeing it years earlier in an after-action report out of Fallujah, attached to a Marine reconnaissance sniper who had dragged wounded Marines out of a kill zone no one survived. A man whose death had rattled the entire Special Operations community. She didn't say it aloud, not yet. Blackwell observed Mara's posture. Too controlled for any intel lieutenant. Calder examined her rifle like it was a coded message. Something hidden. Something heavy. Mara Cade was not who she appeared to be, and for the first time since she had arrived at Redwater Base, everyone around her felt it. The briefing room seemed smaller than it had earlier. Blackwell stood at the head of the table, hands clasped behind his back, expression unreadable. Mara stood a short distance away, not tense, not relaxed, just quietly accepting, as if she already knew where this was heading. Calder lingered by the wall, studying her the way someone examines a long-lost artifact. Mercer slouched in a chair, trying to look confident but failing. Blackwell tapped the table. "Lieutenant Cade, gear up. We're returning to the range." Mercer frowned. What for? She already... Blackwell didn't even glance at him. "We're going to 2300. The room fell still. Hitting at 300 meters wasn't a test. It was a threshold only a handful of shooters in special operations had ever cleared, even under controlled conditions, and fewer still had done it under pressure. Mara didn't complain. She didn't question it. She simply nodded. Minutes later, they crossed the base toward the long-range complex. The rising sun painted gold over the valley, but the air felt tight and brittle, like the truth following them had weight. When they arrived at the firing line, Mara unpacked her rifle with the same quiet certainty as before. No dramatic movements, no hesitation. Calder watched her hands more than the gun. Mara studied the mirage first, her eyes tracing invisible currents through the air. She wasn't estimating. She was reading the wind the way some people read text. She examined the ridge, then the valley, watching dust shift in tiny spirals near the ground. She ignored the atmospheric readouts and the digital crosswind data. Everyone noticed. Blackwell, Mercer, Stroud. She saw the wind not as numbers, but as behavior. Finally, she made a tiny elevation adjustment. Calder frowned. Her correction contradicted the digital readouts by a quarter value. Then she added a half mil right. Another hair upward. Mercer scoffed. "She's compensating wrong. The instruments—" Calder lifted a hand sharply without looking at him. The Master Chief wasn't mocking. He stared because the corrections Mara made weren't random or misguided. They were familiar. They belonged to an era before ballistic computers, when long-range shooting was a craft passed from one operator to another. Calder whispered, stunned, "I haven't seen those corrections since." But he didn't finish the thought. Mara settled her cheek against the stock. The range fell silent. Mercer forced out a shaky laugh, trying to hide the fear tightening in his chest. "She'll be lucky to even graze the plate." His voice cracked on the last word. Mara exhaled slowly, one long controlled breath. Her finger tightened. The rifle thundered across the valley. Time stretched thin. The round rose, vanished into the shimmering heat, then began its long arc downward. 5 seconds. 7. Calder leaned in. 8. 9. A faint metallic ring drifted back across the valley. Dead center. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then, all at once, the entire range shifted. Not with cheering or applause, but with a thick, suffocating silence. Grant Mercer stared ahead, jaw tight, throat working. The confident swagger he relied on cracking. Not collapsing completely, but splitting just enough for humility to seep through. Blackwell kept his tone steady. "Lieutenant Cade, that's enough. I want the truth now." Mara rose slowly, cradling the rifle in her arms, her expression unchanged. No fear, no triumph, only a calm acceptance. She looked at the Admiral and spoke softly. "I made a shot in Syria." Mercer blinked hard. "What kind of shot?" Mara held his stare. 2,840 meters, something like that. I don't recall the decimal. Everyone froze. Blackwell felt a cold pressure pulse through his chest. He recognized the number instantly. He remembered the classified debates, analysts claiming the shot was impossible, committees calling it a statistical glitch. Entire departments burying the report because admitting it was real would force doctrine to change. And the shooter was standing right in front of him. Mara continued quietly. Intel wanted it labeled a lucky hit. They didn't want it recorded. Calder drew in a long breath as memories slammed into him. A name rang through his thoughts. A Marine reconnaissance sniper who had perfected the same barrel-tuning methods Mara used. A man Calder had served beside, trusted, followed. Elias Cade. He stepped closer, locking eyes with Mara as the truth unfolded like a punch to the chest. "Your father," his voice nearly broke. "Mara, your father was Elias Cade." Mara lowered her eyes, saying nothing. She didn't need to. Calder closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, years of buried battles and ghosts weighed down his expression. "He taught you," he whispered. "Of course he did." Blackwell let that truth soak in, the quiet steadiness, the instinctive wind reading, the scar beneath her collar, the Syrian sand pressed into her notebook. None of it was coincidence. None of it was luck. It was legacy. Respect began settling over the group in subtle, undeniable ripples. Mercer straightened, conflict in his eyes. Stroud's gaze softened. Calder planted a hand on his hip as if steadying himself, but the tension didn't fade, because now everyone realized something heavier than rivalry was sitting in the room. Mara Cade wasn't an intel officer with a strange talent. She was the daughter of a legend, and the unspoken question hung over them like smoke. If this was her almost impossible shot, then what else could she do? Blackwell stepped closer to the rifle, almost afraid of the conclusion forming in his mind. He recognized that barrel work, every tiny groove, every impossible-to-teach imperfection carved into steel by craft rather than machines. He had seen it only once, decades earlier, on a ridge in Grenada, when a young Force Recon sniper saved his life with a shot no one believed could be made. Gunnery Sergeant Elias Cade, brother-in-arms, ghost of a legend, a name etched into the memories of every operator who survived Fallujah. Blackwell's usually iron voice thinned. "That accurizing work. Who showed you how to do it?" Mara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Calder stepped even closer, stopping just a foot away, searching her eyes as if looking for the shadow of a man he'd once known. His voice came out low, almost cracked. "You're Cade's daughter, aren't you?" Mara didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She simply nodded once. Quiet, humble, accepting the truth she had hidden for years. Silence spread across the room like a slow-moving wave. Not fear or shock, but recognition. The kind that arrives when the past walks into the present wearing a new uniform. Blackwell felt his posture shift, his shoulders lowering instinctively. His voice softened, stripped of rank. "Your father. He saved my life," he said quietly. "Fallujah took him. But before that, he carried half this community on his back." Mara lowered her eyes, but not in shame, only respect. Stroud straightened sharply, almost at attention. She had heard stories of Elias Cade whispered through sniper schools, repeated in training pits, spoken like scripture among shooters who valued craft more than technology. Her expression shifted from calculation to reverence. Calder swallowed hard. He had fought beside Elias Cade, bled beside him, and buried pieces of himself when Elias never came home. Seeing Mara's movements, her corrections, her discipline, it was like witnessing the last living echo of a dying art. Every trace of mockery vanished from the room. Mercer, once smug and dismissive, now stood frozen, stripped of excuses. No one spoke. No one moved. The air felt thick, emotional, almost sacred, as if the ghosts of Fallujah and Syria stood among them, reminding everyone that legends don't announce themselves. Sometimes they walk in quietly, disguised by modest uniforms and calm eyes, carrying names heavier than any rifle. And now, at last, everything clicked. They understood why Mara Cade had come to Redwater Base, why she kept her past buried, why she carried her father's craft quietly instead of wearing it like a badge. She hadn't hidden because she feared judgment. She had hidden because legacy weighs more heavily than any weapon. Less than a day after her true identity surfaced, the crisis hit. Blackwell was still processing the truth when CMCOM called an emergency briefing. A high-value facilitator in East Africa, a man coordinating weapons pipelines and brokering materials with catastrophic potential, was preparing a mass casualty strike on the U.S. installation in Djibouti. Standard options were eliminated immediately. The target sat deep inside a mountain compound, shielded by hostile terrain and political barriers. There was only one viable solution: a long-range interdiction from nearly 2,800 meters out. Blackwell didn't hesitate. Lieutenant Cade will take the shot. Calder didn't wait for further orders. I'm her spotter. Mercer opened his mouth to object, but Blackwell cut him off instantly. Lieutenant Mercer, you're on exfil security. Mercer swallowed hard, resentment simmering, but the mission was larger than pride, and everyone knew it. Hours later, the team touched down in East Africa beneath a moonless sky, the night air still radiating the heat of a day that had scorched the valley. The ridge overlooking the compound was jagged, covered in loose stones that slid beneath every step, but Mara moved quietly and deliberately, never rushing, never reckless, simply sure. Calder followed a few paces behind, scanning the terrain with the grim instincts of a man who had survived countless nights like this. They reached their hide position, 2,690 meters from the target compound. The valley stretched below them like something alive. Thermals drifting, dust spiraling, wind sliding through layered currents the instruments struggled to measure. Pressure like this breaks even seasoned shooters, Calder murmured. Mara didn't react. For 14 hours she did nothing but observe, tracking how the heat changed with the sun's descent, how wind curled around stone cliffs, how dust rose, dropped, and drifted with invisible currents. She built a mental wind map more accurate than anything Southern Thurland's computers could calculate. Mercer radioed updates in a stiff voice, tension bleeding through every word. He knew he had made a mistake days earlier, a careless conversation with a journalist he thought harmless. He hadn't leaked specifics, but he'd given enough crumbs for enemy analysts to tighten their timeline, and it showed now. Just after dusk, Calder caught sudden movement through the scope. The target appeared early, flanked by lieutenants moving into the courtyard with far less warning than expected. Mercer's strained voice cracked over the radio. "We've got movement. Earlier than planned, they know something." Mara didn't panic. She didn't even speak. She simply exhaled. Calder reached for the wind meter, then froze. Mara was already adjusting her dials. Her corrections contradicted every digital reading. A full shift rate. Slightly higher elevation. Calder felt his chest tighten. Cade, the instruments. She shook her head once. He remembered Elias Cade's voice from decades earlier. Trust the air. Trust your eyes. Feel the shot before you send it. Calder slowly lowered the meter. He leaned close. "Your call," he whispered. "I trust you." Mara settled behind the scope. Her breathing slowed into something mechanical, measured. The valley shimmered under the last dying threads of daylight. She watched the target step into a patch of open ground, then pressed the trigger. The rifle boomed across the ridge, the sound rolling into the valley. The bullet lifted, disappeared into the darkness for a heartbeat, and then another. 5 seconds. 6. 7. The air shifted, winds colliding mid-band and shoving the round sideways. It corrected, dipped, curved, stabilized. 8 seconds. 9. A faint metallic thump drifted up from the compound. Dead center. Calder exhaled in disbelief. "You got him!" Below, chaos erupted. Guards spun, shouting at the sky, searching for drones or aircraft. Not one of them looked toward the ridge nearly 2 miles away. Mara didn't celebrate. She simply began breaking down her rifle with quiet efficiency. Mercer radioed urgently, panic threading his voice. "Patrols are moving. They're sweeping the ridge. You need to exfil now." Calder and Mara slid into the darkness, moving low. Shadows slipping across the rocks. Twice they froze as searchlights swept dangerously close, beams slicing through the night just inches from their position. Once, they even heard voices so close they could feel the breath of enemy soldiers combing the hillside for the ghost who had just shattered their defenses. They stayed completely still. They kept moving only when the night swallowed the danger again. By the time they reached the extraction point, exhaustion clung to them like a second skin, but they made it. Hours later, in a secured Redwater channel, the confirmation came through. The target hadn't merely been coordinating attacks. He had been assembling materials for a radiological strike aimed at nearly 8,000 Americans stationed in Djibouti. Mara's shot didn't just neutralize a threat. It prevented a catastrophe. One bullet, one impossible distance, one quiet lieutenant who carried a legacy the world had almost forgotten. Back at Redwater, the atmosphere shifted from tense to solemn as intelligence analysts pieced together intercepted communications, frozen supply routes, and disrupted financial trails. There was no question. Mara's 9-second shot had changed the trajectory of an entire region and saved countless lives. Yet, she never spoke of it. She didn't ask how much impact it had or what political waves it created. She simply nodded, listened, and shouldered the weight in silence. Grant Mercer wasn't the same man who had mocked her days earlier. He stopped her in a hallway, posture stripped of arrogance, replaced by something unsure, almost ashamed. He drew a breath and admitted, "I was wrong, no excuses." Then he told her his uncle had served in Fallujah, a Marine officer pulled from a kill zone by Gunnery Sergeant Elias Cade. "Your father saved my family," Mercer said quietly. "I should have respected that name from the start." Mara accepted the apology the same way she handled everything, calmly, without bitterness or judgment, just a simple acknowledgement between two people who finally understood one another. Days later, Admiral Blackwell called her into his office. The room was empty except for a shadow box resting on the table. Inside were her father's dog tags, his battered field notes, and a faded photograph of Blackwell, Calder, and Elias Cade standing shoulder to shoulder in Grenada. Blackwell's voice softened as he handed it to her. "I promised him I'd look after you," he said quietly. "He asked me to give you this when you were ready." Mara touched the glass, her thumb brushing the old photo with a tenderness that carried years of unspoken memory. Calder arrived next, carrying the legacy rifle, the old battle-worn M107, crafted with the same extinct tuning method Mara had recognized the very first day she laid hands on her own. The stock had been refinished, but the engravings remained, the names of the marksmen who had carried it before her, ending now with hers. "This belongs to you," Calder said softly. "Your father trusted the craft. Now it's yours to carry on." Weeks later, Mara Cade walked the grounds of Quantico with a renewed sense of purpose. 18 students from multiple branches waited at the firing line, young, hungry, determined. She set the legacy rifle on the table beside her father's battered notebook and addressed them in her quiet, steady voice. "Your ballistic apps won't teach you what matters," she said. "Real strength is quiet, respect is earned in the silence after the shot, and legacy isn't inherited, it's carried." As the wind drifted across the range, her words settled into the hearts of the next generation, and in that moment, the craft Mara had learned in the shadows finally stepped into the light. Most heroes walk among us quietly. You never know which calm face carries decades of courage or which unassuming uniform hides a history built on sacrifice, discipline, and the quiet weight of choices made far from home. Mara Cade never asked for recognition, never chased applause, and never tried to be anything more than what her father taught her to be. Steady, prepared, and humble when it mattered most. Her story is a reminder that true greatness rarely announces itself. It's carried by people who expect nothing and give everything. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Major Tom's Tales for more military and veteran stories, keeping their courage alive for the generations who follow.